When news breaks at 8:15 at night, sometimes we get to it at 9:15 in the morning. Breaking news here on Blue White Illustrated's YouTube channel. I'm Thomas Frank Carr. Sean Fitz with me to give you the latest news from Penn State football. We are starting off spring practice today, Tuesday, with a bang. Fitz, tell us what's going on with Penn State football.
Well, it took a few weeks, but Penn State has a new defensive line coach. In honor of them waiting it out until the day before spring ball, we waited it out until the next morning to talk about it. And it's the guy that was listed actually first on our list, Deion Barnes. I think, it's not really a surprise when you take a look at the genesis of how this all came together. 3 years as a GA, elevated to an analyst role for reasons that, they wanted to keep him around. He made himself sort of forced himself into that role and forced James Franklin to keep him. John Scott leaves. And, a year ago, I'm talking about this hypothetical where John Scott's kid goes to play wherever he goes to play. He's going to Fordham this year on scholarship. So it's time for, that's an apt time for a coach to move on. And when their kid graduates high school, and boom, there's Deion Barnes. Didn't come together as quickly and as seamlessly as I just put it, but they got it done on Monday night. The team was informed. From what I understand, Deion was informed yesterday. So that's it was a pretty cool video. And once we got past that Friday news dump, and I was texting Greg and Nate and Ryan, it was like once we got past that, I was waiting for like a video like that, and it came to fruition. So I have a hard time calling it the obvious choice because there are things that are going to detract from this hire. There's question marks that come into play here, and we can't ignore those. But Deion's been around for a long time. We saw him as a rising star. We saw him as a guy that would eventually be the defensive line coach at Penn State. And now 2023 is that time.
Yeah, we are live here on YouTube. I'm Thomas Frank Carr. That is Sean Fitz. So if you've got a couple questions while we're here on our breaking news element here, throw them in the chat. We'll get to some of those in just a second. Joe's got a question in the chat. I just want to say first as a comment, I love the Deion Barnes story because I feel like this is how most of us get our jobs, Fitz. It's, there's a certain, especially in media, I relate to this really well. You were around for 3 years. You were the part-time guy who just was annoyingly helpful. Can't get rid of you. You have to be around. And finally, he gets the opportunity to have that job. The timing you mentioned of this whole process of John Scott Jr. late in the process gets hired to the Detroit Lions. Then there's this coaching search, which we kind of expected spring break to be the time that's wrapped up. It goes on a little bit longer, I think, than most of us expect, and they make the announcement the day before training camp starts or spring practice opens up. I know we just kind of went over that, but to kind of put it in this light, is it fair then to ask if Deion Barnes is a second or third option and there were other options that were considered before him that didn't quite work out? How do you read the timeline of everything, given that, it's Tuesday morning of spring practice and we're having this conversation?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because if you look, first off, the coaching search, James Franklin is not putting out a tell-all book on his coaching searches, so we're piecing things together. There were several guys that were involved and interviewed. We don't have the names with those right now, but hopefully they come to light. Hines from the Chicago Bears was certainly a big one in there. But I think this is a situation where at some point James Franklin had to say Deion's the guy, and how do you have the the biggest impact? And does it make sense to go through in the spring during spring break? Yeah, it would have been fine. Nobody would have said anything. But I don't think if you're bringing on Deion, you're not forced to do that. If that makes sense. Like I understand that there were questions on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. Like if it's Deion, why isn't it Deion right now? And this was 2 weeks ago. This is before spring break. I don't think it was Deion at that point. There was certainly, wheels turning, and I spoke to Deion at the, just very briefly at the open workout. Yeah, he's praying for it. He's hoping for it. That was still very much up in the air. Then you get to spring break and you think, how can I have the biggest splash here? And Monday, right before you go, if your guy is already on staff, it kind of makes sense. So again, that's all hindsight talking. I do think that there were definitely other guys involved, other guys with more experience. James Franklin's taking a big risk here, taking a guy that's only been a graduate assistant and then a analyst for a month or a month and a half or something like that. So yeah, I think it's fair to question whether, this was the plan in the first place, because I think if it was the plan in the first place, it would have been named a couple of weeks ago. So yes, that's the long answer to a short question is I think that this is something that played itself out, and landed with Deion Barnes. I was going to say settled,
Yeah.
but settled is a terrible word to use in a coaching search. But it landed with Deion, and we're going to see how it goes. It's a big.
If he wasn't a viable candidate, he wouldn't have gotten the job. So I think that's kind of how I've been thinking about this. Is it's not like they settled for Deion Barnes. He was one of the quality candidates, and he's the one they eventually chose. But the how you get there is just as important. I think it is a fair way to phrase that. One other, maybe even not necessarily negative, but outside factor here that I want to talk about before we get to what Deion brings and what we can expect going forward. When you're bringing in a new coach, and this is specific to recruiting, from what I understand, listening to you and Ryan when it comes to recruiting stuff, you're bringing in more connections, more resources, opening up your network further. Do you think that was a major consideration that Deion, they already have his resources. He's already on the staff. Bringing in somebody new is an opportunity to expand that. And as you called it, I think the new coach bump. Is that a part of the lost opportunity that maybe they were exploring? Do you think that was a big factor? And how then, well, just let's start with there. What do you think about that whole setup?
I think yes, there's merit to that because that guy's already on your staff. I mean, that's kind of like the whole thing here, right? It's like what changes because Deion Barnes was going to be on your staff anyway, unless he was, slighted by not getting the job, figure out, maybe this is not the place and maybe move along quickly, something like that. But I think that there's limited, you're probably limiting yourself a little bit in terms of a new coach bump here with recruiting. As you mentioned, he has already done these evals. He has already, forged these relationships. He was able to recruit as an analyst. He was able to recruit as a GA. So you're not changing much in terms of changing the board. This is not like bringing in Marcus Higgins where he's got to get his fresh ideas in there and figure out which receivers are his versus which receivers are Taylor Stubblefield's. For the most part, John Scott and Deion Barnes working on the same page there. So that doesn't change so many things. There's not many fresh evals. The new guy always brings relationships with him, whether that be coaches in a region, whether that be players that he has hit it off with and made, just made these relationships with. You remember when Jaywan Sider came up and John Dunmore was a guy that was, mentioned like every time we brought up John Dunmore, it was Jaywan Sider. Like that, those are the kind of things that you're missing out here. Obviously John Dunmore didn't work out, but that's beside the point here. And you're going to find out right now if there are guys that were, I don't want to say hesitant to play for John Scott, but maybe didn't connect with John Scott as well, and maybe can connect with Deion a little bit more. I'm looking at that region. The region in 2024 is pretty good. So you're going to find guys that maybe are just a little bit more intrigued with playing for a young coach, coach that they can relate to a little bit more. John Scott, for his very good coach, great coach, great teacher, and things like that, didn't really connect well as much with those younger guys from a technology standpoint, from a conversation standpoint, from all that kind of stuff. I think Deion brings a little bit something different there. So I think that's where your new coach bump comes from, is those guys that were like, John Scott doesn't move the needle for me as much, but Deion Barnes might.
Quick question here live in the chat. Thank you to everybody showing up this morning to talk about Deion Barnes and Penn State football with us here at Blue White Illustrated. Like the video if you're here in the chat. Like the video if you're watching on replay. And, as always with a live video, we are here to answer your questions. If you got a super chat, we'll absolutely get to those as well. But Joe asks, hey guys, BWI for life. What's up? I'm curious, what connection does Deion have outside of PA and Jersey with how schools and coaches may be for the very first time in your life? He's into that role. So let me phrase that, add on my own question at the end. Do you know his connections outside of the Philadelphia area, and how hard is it and how quickly can you grow those regional connections and those really important things that we just talked about that you're not getting with a new coach?
Yeah, well, first off, Philly can't be overstated. Like, that is one of the reasons that he came to Penn State in the first place, was Penn State wanted to get back into Philly. They made a concerted effort to do that, offered a ton of kids from there, play up those relationships and things like that. So Philly, South Jersey, of course, he's played with a lot of guys, so he has a lot of connections there. But yeah, this is another one of those legitimate questions, because when you're an analyst, when you're a GA, the connections that you can make with coaches, they have to come to you. You can't go to their schools. You can't get, you don't have a region or anything like that. So you basically have to forge that communication electronically, through the phone, whatever you may have. And then they have to come to you. So most of the connections that he made, which could be very good. I mean, I think he's expanded a little bit. You've signed guys on the defensive line from New York and New England and all over the place, Virginia as well. So I think he's got I think he's got connections, but that's going to be something that he has to work on in the coming years, because like he went from defensive coordinator at Northeast High to graduate assistant at Penn State. Like there's really no in between there. And, he played in the
Yeah.
NFL. That's great, but there's really no in between of building that network. And he's well respected in Philly and South Jersey and Delaware, that area right there. But there's a lot more than that area to what he's going to have to do. He's going to have to do positional recruiting, which, as I mentioned, the region is good. And I think that's one of the good things he's got going for him, is that the region is good, which means he has been in contact with a lot of guys throughout the last year on the defensive line. So he doesn't have to restart relationships or anything like that. From a positional standpoint, we'll see what happens. John Scott had Atlanta. I'm not sure how much of a priority it is to fill that regional area, because you can position, coach, recruit Atlanta. And I think Columbus was one of those. So he had different spots. So Deion will likely fill those areas. And let's be honest, he's a Philly kid. It gives you an opportunity to get into more city kids, to get into more cities and make that connection there, relate with those kids a little bit more. I think that's the biggest thing, is the relatability. So Deion did it as a player, as a prospect. He went through the process as a prospect. He went through the process as a visitor, checking out schools and things like that. He went through the process as a high school coach, where I remember he came up to me at camp years ago, bringing a couple of his Philly Northeast guys that weren't Penn State level, but bringing them up, talking to coaches, talking to us, doing all the things that you need to do. So he understands that part of the game. Then he switches to GA. So he's hosting recruits. He's hosting, just families and things like that, connecting with families. So he's seen it all. And I think that helps him in terms of I guess, loading up his experience. It's only been 3 years, but he's done a lot. And then when you take on top of that his NFL experience, his Penn State experience as a player, and then his recruiting experience, he's learned a lot in 30 years. And that's the other thing. He just turned 30 in January. So I think that there's upside, like a ton of upside here. Deion can be great, but he's going to have to forge those relationships and do a lot of things to continue the work that he's already put in.
We might go just a smidge longer here on our live shows. We usually keep these short, but with breaking news and a great crowd today in the chat asking some great questions, we might just go a little bit over. I want to skip ahead in some of the things that we were going to talk about, Fitz, because we've been hitting recruiting pretty hard. You've mentioned it's a good region. So can you, for people here maybe watching for the first time in the breaking news, recap some of the players that he's going to have the opportunity to recruit that you and Ryan have identified as both Penn State talents and also guys they need to get this cycle?
Yeah, and I encourage you guys to check out our recruiting episode from 2 weeks ago, because this is basically the entire episode was the region in 2024 to work with. So they're going to take a big class, and that's another good thing for Deion here, is he's got probably 7 scholarships to work with, maybe more, 4 defensive tackles, maybe 3 defensive ends. You get a little bit muddy when you talk about hybrid guys. So he's got scholarships to work with, and that'll be something that helps him out. You've got top guys, Bennett Ume from Canada, who's playing in prep school in New England. Jordan Thomas from New Jersey. You've got the Khalil Ahmad connection there, and then on top of that, you've got a younger coach to work with in Deion Barnes. Jared and Jacob Smith, the twins from New England. I think probably Notre Dame at this point for both of those guys. But hey, maybe this is a fresh start. Maybe that's what we talked about earlier. Maybe those are guys that were a little apprehensive on, not playing for John Scott. And maybe this is something that catches their eye, gets them to campus. D.D. Holmes at Gonzaga and Ernest Willer down at IMG Academy. You've got guys that have shown interest, have been to campus, they've met Deion, they've done some things like that. So I think that there's a lot to work with here. It'll be interesting to see if they get even further in with Dylan Stewart, who will be on campus the first week of April. He's the number 1 recruit in the country. I see him going to the SEC. I don't see him going to Penn State, but maybe this is your shot. Who knows? Darian Mayo, Malachi Williams. This is the one that I circle, Philly kid. That is kind of reminds me of Deion at this point in his career. This is a big one for him. So I think that's probably I don't want to say the first test, but maybe you push that one across the line. Malachi's coming to campus this weekend. Maybe you get an opportunity to put yourself in a bigger lead for that one right there. So I encourage you to go back and check out that episode a couple of weeks ago. We talked about those guys. Ryan has talked about Xavier Gilliam on the show yesterday. Caden Brown, Jalen Harvey, names that Darian Mayo. there's a lot out there to work with, and probably a little bit more than we're used to seeing at this point in time, because those bigger bodies of 6'5", excuse me, they were, hey, we're live, 6'5", something. They take a little bit longer to develop. So spring, summer, he'll get out and see those guys during the evaluation period in the spring, and then have guys camp in the summer. So it's a good year to break in a new defensive line coach because you have options. Now he just has to capitalize on those options.
So check this out, bluewhiteillustrated.com. Currently, I think this started this morning, kicking off spring ball in a great way, not just here on the channel, but also at bluewhiteillustrated.com. Our promo has been $29.99 from now to the start of football season. Now it's $10 for the next 4 months, straight up. $10 for the next 4 months. You get inside access. You can get Sean Fitz early reporting on things. You can get Ryan Snyder's deep dives onto recruiting about who, what, when, where, why. You can get my film evals of both Penn State prospects and the blue-white game coming up, where what we actually can take from that game, all of that, plus basketball, everything else, $10 for 4 months. Sign up now. That's our spring ball special at bluewhiteillustrated.com, and then you won't miss any of this information, and then you can enjoy asking the good questions in the chat that we got here from some of our insiders that I know are both here and on the site.
See, Frank, before you get moving, I want to do two things here. The basketball coverage by Nate Bauer, you're not going to find any better. Like the stuff that he's talking about right now, you're not going to find anywhere else. Check that out. And that's they're good right now. So it's fun to follow basketball right now. He's got a ton of insight, not only on the team, but also the inner workings of what's going on. Check that out. And I was asked in the chat to shout out the basketball fundraiser. Guys, freaking amazing. I'm going to call him Bleed because I can't remember if he's I can never remember Northern State, Great White North on our site, but put together a crowdsourced NIL just action, and it was awesome. Like, you guys have done an amazing job. So definitely wanted to shout that out because it is, the Penn State basketball has struggled with NIL. We had Michael Shrewsbury on the show a couple of months ago or a couple of weeks ago, and he was adamant that NIL is not good at Penn State. So really cool to see the grassroots organization from those guys, from every site. It's really cool because if you're going to make Penn State basketball a priority, that's what it's going to take right now. So really cool to see that come together in the last week, and also coincide with Penn State's run through the Big Ten tournament, which was exciting, which was genuinely fun, and was very unlike, the Penn State basketball that we're all used to. So it's really cool to see that in the right direction. And I love Micah Shrewsbury. They got to do what they can to keep him. We'll see if they can do that. But I just wanted to get my pitch in for the basketball coverage because Nate is doing an unbelievable job.
I love learning from you guys. One of my favorite things is I get to learn from the people I work with, and learn more about basketball in the last year with Nate than I have the entire time watching basketball on my own. Just a couple more minutes here on our live show, our impromptu 9 o'clock live show. This is we covered recruiting, but for the room specifically, we need to talk about how much these guys were fighting behind the scenes and publicly for Deion Barnes. So how important is this for the continuity of the defensive line room?
Very big. And I will say this. I said this on the show last week, and guys were pushing for him, but that doesn't matter. Like, that, none of that should have been taken into account by James Franklin. It's not like he was going to have a big revolt, bringing a different guy in or anything like that, but you got to separate that. You got to take that from this, take the comments that you're getting from your players, put it in a pile of information that you're using to make your decision, but not base your decision on that. So I think that there's kind of two sides to that. It doesn't really matter as much, but Penn State players, man, they love this guy. They have been outspoken about him. When I ask players about development, oftentimes Deion was mentioned first before John Scott. So always found that to be interesting. Chop was one of those guys I talked to out at the Rose Bowl, and he just like lit up about Deion. And I think I was trying to get a John Scott quote, but I mean, that's kind of what we got around to. Such a big year for that. Because if you look at the questions that we have about this hire, Penn State seemingly moving into a window where they can make a run. Like, they can, hard to say where the ceiling is. They've got things to work on. They got things to hammer out in spring ball and then in fall practice and things like that. But there's a ton of talent on this team, and defensive line is a pretty important room. So yeah. Does that window align with bringing in a first-year coach? We're not going to know that for a while. So I think that's very interesting. But T. Frank, who do you think this is biggest for in this room? Just looking at, I don't want to put you up. Actually, I do
Yeah.
want to put you on the spot. We're live. That's what we're here for.
Yeah.
But who do you think this is biggest for in the room at end and tackle?
So I'm going to start with the starters, and this is not anybody who needs to take a leap. And I think Chop Robinson can have a superstar turn this year. So getting the most out of him from a technical standpoint, you just mentioned some of the things he's been able to do with his hands. I'm almost as impressed with his hand usage and his ability to rip and get under people as I am his athletic abilities. Adisa Isaac came back this year to prove that he is a top 65 draft pick. He's got the physical talent for it. He's got to put it all together. So I think those two guys, top line, they need to do that for Penn State to become what they want to be this year. End is so important. It is so important to Manny Diaz's defense and pressure, being able to control how long the quarterback has the football. From a defensive tackle perspective, I kind of have been wondering if this is a Keziah Izzard breakout year. I've really liked his physical tools for a long time. He's flashed it for 2 years. He obviously didn't play the first month of the season for the undisclosed reasons, but then he came in and immediately changed the depth chart. It's got to be this year, and if it's not this year, it's not happening. And of course, I've given you 4 guys because Nate's not here, so somebody has to say all of them. And then the last guy I'll highlight is Jordan Vandenberg, because I think he's another guy with the physical talents that needs to take that step from a technique standpoint and an understanding standpoint for Penn State to find answers in run defense. I think he can be a disruptor. He's not going to be a PJ Mustard type, but he can be super annoying to the offensive line by just always being in the backfield, winning blocks, getting off edges, and getting into the backfield. So for those 4 guys, I think this is a very big year for different reasons, whether it's top 15, top 20 pick, I think maybe is what Chop Robinson. I'm very high in his potential to making the team better. And I think those 4 guys, if those 4 guys hit, they have all the ingredients they need to be a very good defensive line.
Yeah. Also, I'll add right here, John Scott thought that Chop was a first-round pick. Like he thinks he can be a first-round pick. And just from my conversations with John. So there's definitely high potential there. I'm going to say deny Dennis Sutton just because you need a guy in that bigger mold that can play against the run. He's got some things to work on. Phenomenally talented, physical, just physical specimen. But is he going to be the guy that takes over that Tarburton role playing the run? I don't know that you have that guy right now. So there's certainly questions there about that. And if you move to the interior, Izzard would be my guy as well. What does Zane Durant, how does Zane Durant factor into all this is a big question that I have, because I think Deion can move him around, use him. Another thing here, and this is more personnel, staff personnel than anything. Penn State now has an analyst hire to make on the defensive line. And if you follow the rule, like if you follow the potential rule changes where you're basically getting analysts that can work with the defensive line, they can work with position groups and things like that. Do you bring in a guy that has a ton of experience that maybe is out of work right now? Maybe, you can hire him away from a lower level, something like that, to help Deion Barnes. I think that is vital. And also they've got a GA hire to make here. And I know that doesn't move the needle here, but it also didn't move the needle in 2020 when Deion Barnes was brought in.
Yep.
So you're essentially refreshing that entire personnel group. You need 3 guys for the defensive line. They've got 1 right now. So in terms of names, look, it's hard enough to find a coaching search, like a position coach search, an analyst role. That's really tough outside of maybe Calvin Lowry, which we kind of nailed earlier this year. So there's a lot to work with there, but they got to refresh that. They got to get that rolling. And the day before spring ball, we will see what happens. Maybe they bring back a former player, a guy that's been around. I think Torrance Brown has been a guy that's been mentioned getting back into coaching. That was a phenomenal story. I don't know how many people remember him, but that was a phenomenal story there. So I think that's kind of where they're at with that. You have to not only reset or restock and figure out your players, but also get back into what you've got in terms of personnel there.
So a couple things to clean up here at the end of the show. First off, thanks to everybody in the chat. Wanted to shout out Beach Wine Guy because he did have that earlier in the chat asking about the GA and analyst role. I forgot to bring it up a little bit earlier, so good job on you and Beach Wine Guy for getting that in.
Beach Wine is great, but that's another podcast. Sorry,
Beach wine or porch beer? Which one's better?
I'll go with porch beer every time, but like,
Okay.
Ask me to pick between my children here, so we're not doing that.
Also, some other news and notes here to end the show. I will go with porch beer as well because I think sand can be super annoying. Not that I want to bring up shades of the first Star Wars trilogy, but we are, because of the schedule today, James Franklin is at noon, so we'll bring that to you basically after it happens. We will have a live replay of James Franklin's press conference shortly after he concludes. Then practice is coming up tonight. That is going to be in the evening. It is going to conflict with the time of the BWI live show on Tuesday, which normally comes to you at 7 o'clock. So we're pushing that until tomorrow. So if you want to get a full recap of everything that happens today, bluewhiteillustrated.com is your first place to get the written stuff. We'll be having our Penn State two-a-days coming out where we're previewing some of the positions, all the positions, all week long to get you primed and ready for training camp, spring camp, which happens this week. This tends to sneak up on everybody, so I like to preview it during it happening to wake everybody up at the same time. And then the last thing is, of course, subscribe here to Blue White Illustrated on YouTube and bluewhiteillustrated.com for all of that information. I'm Thomas Frank Carr. Sean Fitz with me this morning. Fitz, thank you so much for being on with us and for giving us the information on Deion Barnes. That'll do it for today on the BWI Live Breaking News, which turned into a full show. So you got your Tuesday show anyway. We'll talk to you tomorrow.